bottom. But so I have the URL address for the calendar of events for Preservation and Archaeology Month at the bottom of the screen here. I'll put it up at the end of the talk as well. But you can go to this calendar on the web and find out about other events that are going on, both in the immediate area around here and all across the state. So, I mean, you guys have a lot going on here. There's some really impressive programs going on right in your backyard. But if you have time to check out some other programs that are going on across the state, it's a great way to find out, what's happening. So I do want to say thanks specifically to Jesse, because we've been kind of in touch about this project for like a year and a half now. Yeah. So I've given a version of this talk in Belleville some time ago, and it's really nice to have the opportunity, thanks to Jesse, to come up here to this end of the township and be able to share with you all what we've been doing for the last almost 2 years now on this project. I've got my remote here. Hang on. So this is what I have for you today. So basically, we're going to share with you some initial results of our archaeological survey along Highway 69. As you know, probably you've heard many times by now, DOT is planning on doing some significant reconstruction in the next few years. And so our work is kind of related to that. But what I really have to show you is essentially about 10,000 years of human history that exists essentially right down the road from where we are. If you go out of this parking lot, hang a right, and just keep on going towards Belleville, you will pass an extraordinary amount of human history that might not even realize was there. And in fact, we didn't realize was there until we really started looking. So that's what I have for you. I really just like to start a lot of my talks with this image, because I think it's kind of great. It sort of captures for a lot of us the kind of preconceptions we have about what archaeology is, right, and where it gets done. A lot of people are surprised when I say, oh yeah, we're doing archaeology in Verona Township. And they say, why bother? What's there? Should you be working in some exotic location with temples and volcanoes and hidden temples, or hidden goddess statues? As it turns out, I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but we know that there is actually a lot of really cool history buried right in our own backyard that archaeology as a tool is a great way to learn about. So I think there's good reasons to be doing what we're doing, but to sort of contextualize why we're working on Highway 69, I want to tell you a little bit more about our program and why we're doing this project for Wisconsin DOT. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the geology and the hydrology of this area, because as many of you probably also already know, this is a really unique environment that you live in. And a lot of that is because of the rocks, right, the glaciers, the ice, and the river itself that have created this very rich environment that people have wanted to live in for millennia. So I want to talk a little bit, sort of give you that quick geological history and how it relates to the human settlement that we're looking at as archaeologists. And then we'll go through about 10,000 years of history in little slices at the end of the talk. And I have, at the very end, I want to save time, some material I've added that are kind of the most recent discoveries we have on some of the 19th century farmsteads that existed, formerly existed along this corridor, that are kind of particularly relevant to Verona history. So that's how we're going to work. But this is sort of the big picture, right? This is Highway 69 running between Verona at the north there and Belleville. This is our study corridor. This is the area that Wisconsin DOT is planning to reconstruct. And so our survey work is really part of the whole planning process for this construction work. In kind of government speak, right, the work that we do is often referred to as cultural resource management. For Section 106 archaeology, it's referring to the federal statutes that allow us to do this work. And essentially, what I'd like to frame the sort of spirit of this legislation for people in the notion that construction projects that are using federal taxpayer money, like yours and mine and everyone else's money, should not end up resulting in the destruction of local historical sites. And I think this is an important thing to remind people of in this era, when there seems to be kind of a notion that all regulation is bad regulation. But I think it's worth keeping in mind that there are these regulations that are designed to protect local communities from the overreach of the federal government itself. And this is one of those that we are allowed to work under. So that's what we do. We go out there, we locate the sites, we help engineers kind of try to avoid them, preserve them in place if possible. And then if not, then we do the excavations to try to recover that information before it's all lost to the bulldozers. And we basically look everywhere. We leave no pasture, untested. No cow pie is unturned. So we started this work back in 2015, and over the 9 miles of the corridor between Verona, sort of the south side of Verona and Belleville, we found 31 sites. That includes both sites that we discovered, as well as sites that had been previously recorded that we were able to relocate. Of those sites, we found 3 that were specifically just historic period Euro-American homesteads, 4 sites that combined both Euro-American historical components with prehistoric components, and then 22 that were strictly what we call pre-contact, but prehistoric Native American sites, and then 2 burial sites, 2 prehistoric burial sites. So that's a long list for 9 miles, but I was given the indication that this was probably a record for a survey on a 9-mile stretch of highway. So this is a really, really archaeologically, historically rich area. And so that's our phase 1 survey. Then we go to phase 2. This is where we evaluate the sites that seem to be have more promise for research potential. And we recommended 14 of those 31 sites for additional work. And we've got work ongoing at 12. 2 of them they actually were able to completely avoid, and it's possible that they will avoid more of them as well as they finalize their designs. And that's really the preferred option. But really, so did anybody make the drive here from Belleville or come up 69 today, right? Okay, so the reason why there are so many sites out there is really basically right out your car window as you're driving up this way. And if you look out your window as you're driving through that area, it's just an extraordinarily rich area. You have these beautiful floodplains right along the river, and then you've got some meadows, some low marshy areas. Got lots of springs. You see a lot of active springs in this area, and that's going to be really important as far as why the patterns that we're seeing for human settlement. Marshes, which were prehistorically actually very important resource areas for people for gathering food and necessary raw materials. Then you have these big, flat, fertile terraces, right? And it's a little dark, but anyway, we have a lot of bedrock outcrops out there, right? These really sort of stately, picturesque outcrops, and they have a sort of hidden importance as well. I'll talk about it in a minute. And then you've got these incredible high terraces, these high ridge lines that when you're on the top of, you can see for miles and miles up and down the river. And that also, is very significant in terms of why anyone would want to spend time here, right? So we've got this really diverse landscape here, largely because of the interaction of the rocks and the glaciers and the river over thousands of years, right? Millennia. Let me just point out. So if you see, this is our study corridor here, and you can see this is a bedrock map of the local area. You can see there's all kinds of different bedrock structures underneath this very diverse, geologically diverse area. And this is our sort of bedrock cake, layer cake, if you will, of the entire state. Under Dane County, you sort of have this chunk of the cake present. Late Cambrian, early Ordovician sandstones, dolomites. So this is old rock. And I was just speaking with someone earlier. This is early material. And you see we're right above volcanic rock material at its base. Now in our sort of Sugar River watershed area, we just have this slice of the cake. And the reason I want to highlight that is we also have right at the top of it, on those high ridges, we have the Shakopee sandstone. And that's the reason why some of these ridges and these bedrock outcrops are significant, because they contain what's called chert in nodule form. And this was an important source of stone tool-making material for prehistoric people. So not only does this area have this very environmentally diverse set of microenvironments, if you will, they also offered the raw material that prehistorically people used for making stone tools available immediately. So that's our bedrock. Then we have the glaciers come in, right? 85,000 to 9,500 years ago, glaciers moved. That was the last major glaciation that affected North America. And Wisconsin was only covered for glaciers for part of that time. They hit their maximum extent about 16,000 years ago. And why that is interesting for us is, if we look right here down in Dane County, this is a map of the maximum extent of the ice sheets, of the Laurentide ice sheet. You see the Green Bay Lobe here comes right across Dane County, about 2/3 of the way, and then it stops right there. And So we have glaciers to the northeast, no glaciers to the southwest. And what that causes is, when we look at the local area again, here we have in purple, this is the terminal moraine, right, the maximum extent of the last major glaciation. And here's our study corridor again, right? So if you look, it's straddling all of these really different geological landscape, landform areas. And what's particularly interesting, if you look at that big sort of brown blob right there that's right between the two lines, that is actually one of the few remnants of landscapes that predate the last major glaciation. So these areas, these landscapes were not touched by the glaciers, nor were they affected by the most recent glaciers, nor were they affected by the melting of the last glacial expansion. So they're kind of almost remnants of an earlier time, if you will, preserved in the landscape. So we have all that going on right here. And of course, then there's the river. The river has left its mark on the landscape and continues to. Right? We know in its present form, it's about 5,000 years old. There actually hasn't been a lot of research on the evolutionary history of the river itself. We're actually hoping that as part of our project, we'll be able to fill in some of those gaps. I'll talk about that in a minute. But I think the most important thing, probably, for me anyway, about the river, and possibly for prehistoric people, was that it's largely spring-fed. And so y'all know, even in the driest seasons, there's probably going to be a bit of a trickle and maybe even enough water to paddle in the Sugar River. And that makes this a really important transportation highway, if you will. This is kind of how we think about the river today, but we have to remember, for thousands and thousands of years, that river was a major transportation route for both prehistoric people and for historic European people who settled in this area. It was the way to get around before the road system developed. And it's actually a project we're working on as well. But, so, if we look, along Highway 69, if you're making that drive from Verona to Belleville, think of all the times that you cross over the Sugar River or run parallel to the Sugar River, and all of those locations probably have some sort of prehistoric and likely as well historic period archaeology associated with them, because that's where people were. They were settling on the ridges and the terraces right off the river, right off their highway, right? So one more little thing that I kind of love about the river. So we know the river is continually evolving, and there's a great set of aerial photos from 1938 that really illustrate this well, I think. So if you take a look, so this is where we're just southeast of Belleville here. This was just a good example. But you can see the river as it ran in 1938. And then if you look kind of in the fields, the plowed fields, you'll see all these kind of swirly patterns of lighter and darker soil. Right? These are channel scars. These are remnants of old channels of the Sugar River, where it used to run thousands of years ago, and they've been filled in, but they're exposed in these plowed fields. So we can really get to start to see how the river has moved over the years. And in our archaeology, that's become really important, because what we found is, so we're really just south of Verona here. We have an archaeological site here. We know that. It's a little odd, because normally that site would be located right out on the point, right at the bend in the river. Right? But it's not right now, or it wasn't even right then. But we had a geomorphologist, a soil scientist, come out and do some testing, and sure enough, he was able to find yet another invisible buried channel of the river that ran right across, sort of bounded the site, just as we would have expected, putting it right out on a bend at a point where that would be an ideal place to pull up a canoe for the night, right? And similarly, just a little bit south of there, I have two nice sites right on a nice little terrace overlooking the river, and there's no river there now, but a few thousand years ago, our geomorphologists tell us that was another active river channel. And so we can start to see, again, how as we start to understand the human settlement patterns for this area, we're actually understanding more about the river's history as well, the river's physical, geological history as well. So that's pretty much a no-brainer here. That's why we've got so much of a record of human settlement in this location. So as I kind of move into this notion of what we can find as remnants of evidence of the past 10,000 years of human history here, it's good to know these are basically the things that we have available to us as archaeologists, right? A lot of things just don't survive. But what we typically find the most of is this stuff here. It's chipping debris, right? It's the leftovers from stone tool making. And the reason we find so much of that is that this whole stone tool-making tradition is a subtractive process, right? You start with a big chunk of stone, and you slowly chip it down, you whittle it down to the right shape and size for the tool that you're looking for. And that produces an enormous amount of waste, essentially, that we find a lot of scattered all across the landscape. But of course, the problem being, we don't get that process hasn't changed over the millennia very much. So, finding a bunch of flakes in the ground doesn't tell us a lot about when people were there. So we looked to other items that we'll talk about in a minute to try to understand the chronology, the time periods that people occupied the landscape in different locations. But when we talk about sort of time and periods and traditions in archaeology, this is sort of a rough schematic of what we mean by that. It's a very abstract way of dividing up human history. The reason we do it in these big blocks is that each of these periods, the Paleo-Indian, the Archaic, the Woodland, they represent periods where we can see really distinct changes in the way people carried out their lives, right? The different kinds of technology they had available to them, different forms of subsistence, different ways of making a living, essentially, off the land. And it's important to keep in mind that, we really don't know, there are a lot of things we don't know about these people that we talk about. We really have no idea what they call themselves. We have no idea, absolutely. Only the most general senses of the languages they spoke. And from an archaeological point of view, it's actually very difficult when we think of modern Native American tribal groups. It's very difficult for archaeologists to take those tribal groups and project them back in time to understand how they relate to people who lived in this part of the world 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 years ago, because we've lost so much, right? Because so many things are just not preserved in the record. But with that in mind, there are some things we can figure out. So this is what we call the Paleo-Indian period. Paleo-Indian is a name that archaeologists have created, right? It's not what they called themselves, by any means, I can guarantee that. But, oh no, that's fine. These are the first people who kind of braved the changing climate at the end of the last glaciation to move up into the upper Great Lakes area, literally as the glaciers themselves were melting and receding. So these were tough people. They traveled pretty much constantly. They hunted, they followed herds of what we call Pleistocene megafauna. These are your mammoths and your mastodons and your antique bison, enormous creatures. The implication for that is that here you have small groups of people with very simple technology traveling all the time. They're really hard to find. They don't leave a big footprint on the land. There are three sort of sub-traditions within what we call the Paleo-Indian period. And I'll talk about those in a moment. But just in terms of kind of understanding their technology, these were the people who used spears to hunt mammoth. If you think about what that means, having to get that close to a massive animal. But they also used what are called atlatls. These were levers that allowed them to project a spear or a dart much more powerfully, much more accurately. We don't always think about that kind of technology from this era. But these are also probably the people that we can thank for bringing domesticated dogs into North America. So from our study corridor, right, just south of where we're sitting right now, on a beautiful high ridge overlooking the Sugar River, we found what we can identify as what's called a Clovis point. The reason, so it's a fragment, it's the image on your left there, but the reason we can identify it is it clearly has evidence of what we call fluidity. This was a very, very difficult, extremely, a process that required an immense amount of skill to achieve, by which the stone toolmakers would drive a large linear flake off of the base of their final point in order to make it possible to bind that point very stoutly to the tip of their spear or dart. And if you think about it, if you're going to go face to face with a mammoth, you're going to want like a pretty stout weapon on your hands. So these are very distinctive. These are the tools that allow us to recognize those first people who moved back into this part of the world as the glaciers receded. About 11,000 to about 11,000 years ago. Now this technology changes very quickly. So all of a sudden, by the late Paleo-Indian period, you see a much coarser, form of stone tool technology as people are moving away from hunting the megafauna, the really truly large creatures, and relying more on bison and deer and other animals. They realize, well, we don't have to have this extremely difficult to make high investment tool to be successful hunters. So we can get by with something like this, and that was a much better use of their time in this era. So we see a real change in technology as we move forward. Then we move into what's called the Archaic period, and the reason that we have this point where things break up is twofold, really. So the climate is changing at this point in time. We have prairie environments moving into this part of the world as the climate is settling down from the last major glaciation. And that's changing the habitat, the animals that are available. And what we see is groups of people are starting to no longer move constantly as they follow game herds, but they're settling down and still moving seasonally around the area, but spending more time in one place. And that's great for us, because that means they leave a bigger footprint on the ground. So we know much more about the Archaic period for all kinds of reasons. We'll see they typically produce smaller projectile points because they're, once again, no longer relying on a manually driven spear, but they're relying much more on this atlatl, this spear throwing device, and they're hunting smaller animals. So we also see a much more elaborate stone tool technology, and these are also the first people to start to utilize the native copper that was available, very easily on the surface all across the UP. People realized at this time that this could be used to make tools as well. So we see a real blossoming of the copper tool and copper implement production in this period. Also axes, we see all kinds of stuff. The presence of axes is kind of interesting because it suggests that they were making significant efforts to clear land, probably for what you say is sort of nascent, not full-blown agriculture, but manipulating plants in their environment to produce food in a way that they hadn't before. Hence, we separate them off from the Paleo-Indian period. And there's a lot of evidence from this era also of the really rich technology in plant fibers, or animal skins, right? Basketry, that predates the Archaic period, no doubt, but it survives from this period. And it was, we think about this era, right, as the Stone Era, right? But in a way, it's also the Copper Era. And before that, it still relied on a fundamental technology that used lots of fibers and animal materials that we just don't know about anymore. But what we do have, right, are the stone tools. And as you can see, as I know I don't have a scale here, but as things move forward in time, we start to see points growing smaller and smaller. These are Radix points from kind of the middle Archaic era, again from just down the road, from several sites. And these are probably more literally dart points than spear points as we start to talk about it, because the technology is changing. And as we see moving forward kind of into the later, more recent Archaic period, the points are growing arguably cruder, right? Once again, they're sort of realizing you don't have to put all that much effort into producing this perfect object in order to throw it at an animal and survive, right? So our last period here, this is the last major chunk of time that's represented within our project area. This is called the Woodland period. Like, this is kind of a very big period of change in human history in North America. The climate starts to settle down. It's much more, what we would recognize, right, as a modern climate. There's a lot of domestication of plants for food. Like corn, beans, squash become available in this era. And so we see a much more settled lifestyle that's relying much more on agriculture, true sort of agriculture, rather than hunting. But of course, hunting remains a big part of it as well. You can't grow food all the time in Wisconsin. So there was still a seasonal change. People would gather in the summers in agricultural villages, continue to hunt, but then in the winter, when the food ran out, family groups tended to split out, go into the high grounds and the low grounds and hunt for the winter, to survive until the next spring, hopefully, would come around. So we have all kinds of important developments in this period. The bow and arrow become available, significantly increasing hunting efficiency. We've got pottery, which I'll talk about in a minute, which had not been produced before this period. And then we have these really elaborate burial practices that we can also see the remnants of on the landscape right here. So here, again, from our study area, evidence of the woodland. So this is a woodland style, or woodland period Mangers point. you see, it doesn't look a lot different from archaic points, and you would be right. This is probably more of a dart point than a bow and arrow, because the atlatl and the spear, the projected spear dart, continued to be used, even as the bow became introduced. But as we move on in time and get later in the woodland period, we see points becoming more and more like what we would immediately recognize ourselves as, oh, that's an arrow point. That's definitely an arrow point. And by the time we get to the end of the woodland period, immediately, this could be, strapped onto a modern arrow shaft, and it would look and work just like what we have now. The other reason that archaeologists tend to really like the woodland period is that this was the period when people began to experiment with producing pottery, with producing ceramics, right? In North America, it had not been done in any era that we know of before this, and it creates, for us as archaeologists, another piece of material culture that can survive underground for thousands of years. It doesn't survive well, it's still pottery, it's still fragile. And in this era, it was very coarse, and it was very low fire. So what you tend to see are these little chunks, little flat chunks of stuff that look a lot like a piece of dirt until you clean them up. And then you can start to see, oh, okay, this was something someone made. You can see a lot of the patterns. So these are samples that we found just north of Belleville in our study corridor here. These are late middle and late woodland pottery types that are common to this region of Wisconsin. And if you can kind of see, the slide's a little dark, but a lot of the decorations from this era, they did try to decorate these things. They weren't just purely utilitarian. And a lot of the decorations are based on kind of naturalistic patterns. Like you can see, we've got a laser, right? In this one here, you can kind of see a crosshatch pattern. That was typically produced with a fiber net, right? That was wrapped around the soft clay before it had hardened. And this sample here, you can see a lot of vertical striations. Just hand tooled into the soft clay. So they were functional objects, but they were also aesthetic objects. Like people tried to make these look like something that they were familiar with and was pleasing to them. So it's a very interesting material culture. Not my favorite artifact, I have to admit. But it's great when you find a whole one, but that doesn't happen very often. So the other great thing we have from the woodland period here in Verona Township is, of course, burial mounds from the woodland period. This is just a drawing from a site in Waukesha, but it shows the two typical types of burial mounds that were produced during this period. You have your geometrics, conical and linear mounds, and then you also have what we are calling now effigy mounds, right? These were mounds that were built out of earth in the shape of various animals, spirit forms, and then also human figures in some cases. There's still one surviving, it's called Man Mound, up in Baraboo that you can go visit. It's pretty stunning. It's a very strange landscape to walk over. But here, we have historic records of quite a few mounds in this area, both geometric and effigy. But one of the surviving ones that we found in the study corridor was right here. It's just south of Badger Mill Creek, right off the Sugar River. You can see there's not much left of it. This was a conical mound. It was actually excavated in the 19th century. But it's that little low rise that has the massive tree growing out of it. Allegedly, there were effigy mounds associated with the same site, but we have yet to be able to relocate them. So they may no longer be extant above ground. But there could still be burials here associated with it, because they were typically burials. All right, so we have to jump a great deal of time forward for the next sort of evidence of human life that we have here in this area. The historic period in North America typically is arbitrarily set to begin at about 1650 when European explorers really kind of moved into this part of the world. But for us, we don't really have European presence until the 1830s for the most part, when we have the first permanent European settlement here in Verona Township. And that's, if you can kind of imagine, this is difficult to see in the woods here, but my colleagues here are actually working in a little depression just on the south bank of Badger Mill Creek, just east of Highway 69. And it turns out that this is the location where two Scottish men who had been working and living in the Four Lakes area went out on an expedition to try to find some land to settle southwest of the Four Lakes area with another party, with a larger party. They eventually came to Badger Mill Creek, crossed the creek, and decided this is it. This is the perfect landscape. So they built a little dugout house on the bank of Badger Mill Creek, according to the story. stashed some of their gear, went back to Four Lakes to resupply. Overnight, there was a big thunderstorm. The Badger Mill Creek swelled to a flood, washed all their gear downstream. So when they returned the next day, they found an empty hole, which is exactly what we found. Unfortunately, we found a hole in the bank that was empty. But it fairly closely correlates to the location of this description. And so what this was, it's Young and
James Young and
Stewart, right? Yes, Young and Stewart, not to be deterred by inclement weather, decided to climb up the ridge that they had dug into the bottom of to create their first shelter, dug another shelter up there, and as they're digging for their new shelter, they unearthed the bones of some Native Americans who had been buried on top of the ridge. So they set those aside, built their house, and 1837 we have the first permanent settlement in Verona Township. So now I'm going to move forward a little bit. This is, I'm going to leave some time for questions, but this is what I get really excited about. So we have found a number of farmsteads that are no longer visible on the landscape in the study corridor, and this is one of them. This is one of the really exceptional ones. So you can see we were working in a field here, and we uncovered the alignment of a sandstone block foundation. And when we check, I love these 1938 aerials because they just show you all kinds of stuff. When we went back to the 1938 aerials, we looked a little closer. If you can see right where our sandstone foundation is, there's a little kind of darker linear stain here, sort of highlighted against the lighter color of the field there. That is the remnant of a farm that was demolished and turned under in the early 1930s. And this is all that was left of it by 1938, just the stain, and then what we found on the ground. As we looked at the earlier plat maps, we were eventually able to correlate this structure here from the 1890, this is the 1890 plat of Montrose Township. So it's sitting on land owned by Stanton Miller at the time. And probably the Miller family is probably familiar to just about everyone. This is one of the progenitors of the Miller family of Verona. Stanton, in the early 1880s, he purchased a large portion of this chunk of land, along with his brother, John H. Miller, purchased the land immediately north of him. You can see Stanton's land just creeps up into section 33, so we're just on the edge of Verona Township here. But the Miller family, who became really significant in the development of Verona Township, originally hails from Charles Sr., who, I love this, I've never seen this appellation given to anyone before, the Farmer King of Evansville. So the Miller family was already a pretty well established. This is in the 1893, right? So essentially on Charles's deathbed. But early settler to the area, extremely well established, very financially successful family. And let's see, John and Stanton were two of the Farmer King's sons, farmer princes, I guess, right? And so they move into this area in the 1880s, and then they become really significant. They're large landowners. John becomes president of the Verona Bank. If not president, he's one of the sort of main movers and shakers in the development of the local telephone company here. Stanton becomes president of the Belleville Bank, and eventually he invests heavily in land out in Montana, I believe, becomes a massive landowner out there, and eventually he passes away in California, in Long Beach, California, of all places. He's quite a mover and shaker. So in addition to the foundation that we found at the site, we also found this kind of circular stain just off the back of the house, and kind of looks like this, about 4 feet in diameter. And when we started to dig into this, which what we believe is an old earthen walled cistern that would have captured rainwater from the roof of the house for domestic use, right? It just turned out to be a time capsule, just full of all kinds of amazing domestic household debris that was thrown out sometime around the period that the Stanton Miller family owned the property. I'm going to say owned because there's a little problem that I'm going to ask for your help with at the end of this. But I just wanted to give you a sense of just how diverse and how remarkable a little view of what a fairly affluent late 19th, early 20th century farmhouse is provided by the material in the cistern. We found toy soldiers. We found about half a dozen little, and they're actually, at the size that you would expect them, molded lead toy soldiers, flat, not the three-dimensional ones that we're more familiar with. I saw, the Kepi style hat here, and right away I thought, oh, okay, Union Civil War soldiers, right? So I took him to our toy soldier expert, and he said, well, maybe, but he pointed out, I don't know if you can see, but there's a little bit of red on the cuff here, and some of the other examples have red on the cap. He said, I think these are actually soldiers, French soldiers from the Franco-Prussian War. He said, what are these doing on a farmhouse in Verona, in 1890? But apparently, the confusion is understandable, so I didn't realize that our Civil War Union Army uniforms were essentially based on a lot of French army, and our entire army was sort of based on the French military system. So there's a reason for that resemblance, but it just, it was one of those examples where I realized I really can't assume that I know anything until I talk to the experts on this. The time period's about right, 1860s, the Franco-Prussian War was 1871, 72, I think, but fascinating, Other evidence of childhood presence at the site, some porcelain doll fragments. These are fairly high quality items, and you'll see that kind of is a theme throughout this collection. Soundboard from a harmonica, musical instruments, lots and lots of suspender buckles and fasteners, a lot of clothing fasteners. And this one, I don't know if you can see it, but these two in particular are quite elaborate. But this one has really caught my attention. It's actually got a sort of filigreed dog outlined into the buckle. Very beautiful, very clever. This is not going to show up. This is a bummer. But so on the left is a fragment of a slate tablet, and if the slide were a little better, you'd be able to see score marks for lines that divide the tablet up horizontally. So we're pretty sure this was a tablet that was used for handwriting exercises. You can picture, for all of you who remember having to do handwriting exercises, right? You can picture the lines, right, that you had to stay within. This is one of those. This is a very early one of those. And then we also found this, which I think you can just let your imagination run wild with. The landowner was absolutely captivated with this. It's a hand-carved piece of sandstone. The property's got significant sandstone outcrops. It was probably, picked up or mined locally or quarried locally, and someone just shaped it, into a heart. And who knows? It was a Mother's Day present, Valentine's Day present, something. Yeah, it's just very charming. But it gives you this really kind of personal look at, this household that you wouldn't expect you could necessarily find from a bunch of junk thrown into a cistern. Then we found numerous ink bottles. So this was a very literate family as well. I mean, literally dozens of empty ink bottles, both stoneware here on the left, which was less common, but not unheard of, and then the more traditional kind of umbrella glass ink wells that we see. And then lots and lots of dishes. Ironstone, white dishes molded with a kind of typically floral botanical patterns that were common for that sort of second half of the 19th century. But it's worth mentioning, they threw out a lot. This is the stuff they threw away. So keep that in mind, kind of as we think about what this means. Oh, and because a lot of the stuff is fairly high style, it's marked with the factory that produced them, so we can trace it back to where it was manufactured, where it was imported from, the time periods that it was produced in. So very valuable for us as archaeologists, in addition to all the documentary history we have. And some stoneware crocks, right? I mean, you see these all the time, but you don't always see these all the time. Even their stoneware crocks were kind of fancy. And I threw this in, this is a fairly conventional crock, but if the light was a little better, you'd be able to see, you can still see the fingerprints from this crock, which was handmade. And as the potter smoothed out the bottom of the vessel, you can still see that potter's fingerprints in there. So it's a handmade product. Unlike this one, which is one of my other favorite objects, this was a later crock, 15 gallons. And as my coworker, Katie and I, putting it all back together again. But it's just an enormous, enormous thing. But, this probably would have been used, right, to produce your sauerkraut or your pickles stored in the basement. And then lots and lots of really elaborate glass. This on the right, this beautiful Gothic-style sauce bottle would have literally contained some sort of sauce, probably not hot sauce, but fish sauce, something of that nature. And on the right, this just blew me away. So this is a pattern molded cruet. So this is one of those types of cruets that would be in a caddy with 3 or 4 other cruets matching, maybe silvered caps on the top, and they would have been used to dispense vinegar, oil, sauce of various sorts. So, so this was a very fancy table that this farmstead set. One of my coworkers grew up on a farm outside of Madison, and he looked at this and he said, "I grew up on the wrong farm. We didn't have any of this when I was growing up." So this is not your typical 19th century farmstead deposit. And the other thing that sets it apart is just an enormous number of embossed patent medicine bottles, enormous, hundreds, literally. On the left here, this is a great one. This is, you can't quite make it out, maybe a little bit if you're close up. St. Jacob's oil. Oil is spelled O-E-L. This was intentional. The manufacturer spelled it in the German form to market specifically to Germanic consumers, right, in America. This other one, this middle one here, is gargling oil from Lockport, New York. And on the right, this is Warner's Safe Kidney and Liver Cure. This is actually a really important company. So probably a lot of you are familiar with there were scandals emerging in the late 19th century as people were actually recognizing that they were being sickened and even killed by the contents of the over-the-counter patent medicines that they were buying to try to make them feel better, because the ingredients were sort of a list of poisons in a lot of cases. And so Warner's picked up on this and said, no, our products are safe. So they emblazoned their bottles with a big metal safe. And it wasn't long after this that what has grown into the Food and Drug Administration comes into play and starts to regulate the contents of these over-the-counter drugs. So yeah, it's kind of a neat little piece of medical history, if you will. Okay, so I want to wrap up, leave some time for questions. But this is the question I have for you. So this is our problem at this moment in time. So here's our site that we know in 1890, about the same time that all this trash was disposed of in an abandoned cistern. Stanton Miller owned the property. But as you see, look, there were 2 houses on the property in 1890. And we know from land records that Stanton Miller purchased this portion of the property to the west first. So we presume he was living here with his family. So the question becomes, whose stuff are we finding? Who lived here? And so far we do not have a good answer. We have this beautiful collection of really, really affluent material culture. Again, keeping in mind stuff that this household thought was worth throwing away. So imagine what they kept as they probably left the property. We don't know who lived there. This is 1890 that we're looking at. So the 1890 census, as many of you know, was lost to us, burned, I think. Burned or flooded out? One or the other. Anyway, there's no original copies left. State census is not adequate to really figure out who was living there, assuming that the Millers were renting it out or leasing it to a relative, perhaps. So if anyone here has any suggestions, family stories, anything of the sort that might help us, associate this collection with a family, yeah.
I looked at a later map and it showed Peter Clark in the area where that house would have been.
Clark was actually earlier.
Was it earlier?
Yeah. If we look at the 1870s and 60s, I think it's Peter Clark and someone else after that, like Bullard, I believe. But and I believe it's probably Clark and Bullard who were responsible for building both of these houses. They were built out of the same materials, but our crux is really right here in the 1880s and 90s, figuring out whose stuff this really is. So I'm gonna leave it there. Let me have lots of folks I'd like to thank, and thank you. And like I said, I'll be happy to take any questions y'all have.
Yeah, the cistern, were these objects thrown into the cistern over time, or do you think they were just discarded when the people left?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, were the objects that we recovered from the cistern thrown away all at once, or was it a sort of deposit that accumulated over time? And it looks like a bit of both. There seems to be a bit of kind of kitchen debris and random objects that maybe broke around the household and were dumped in the cistern over time, but then eventually, at the end, it looks like we do have this massive dumping of household debris that's probably associated, kind of in a way that you would get rid of a lot of stuff that you don't think you're going to use when you move. It was basically that kind of process. All those medicine bottles they probably had laying around the house. They said, oh, well, we don't want to take those to, Montana or California or wherever we're going, in the cistern. And if they were selling the property, the cistern was an empty hole in the ground, an open hole in the ground. that they needed to fill up. So it was a convenient way to get rid of some garbage and clean up the house, get ready for sale. So yeah, great question. But yeah, that's what we understand about it.
How deep did you dig down in the cistern?
Yeah, so the cistern was about 6.5 feet. Sorry, the question was how deep was the cistern? It's about 6.5 feet below the modern ground surface. We assume that hasn't changed a lot in 150 years. It was about 4 feet in diameter. And as I said, it was an earthen walled cistern. So it's a pretty basic affair, not the kind of thing that someone who was pretty well established would build. So this was probably built very early on in the settlement of this parcel of land, 1840s, 1850s. This has been sort of the original thing that they used to capture water, maybe before they even had time to build a well. But over time, because it wasn't walled in with rock or even mortar or plaster, those earthen walls just started to slump in because of the moisture, the moisture from the contents, and it became unusable as a cistern. So they presumably replaced it, but we didn't find what they replaced it with. And then it became a handy disposal place for garbage, right? And that's a common evolution for these early yard features in farms. Yeah, Mary?
Since I know where it is very well.
Right.
I know in the stone house, the later one, that was taken down later,
Mm-hmm.
where the new house is now, it used to be garden, and every time Dad would plow it up, we'd always find pieces of pottery and stuff like that. There were trees up there. And that kind of stuff, so we'd always find pieces of pottery and things like that, because basically it was a dumping area behind the house.
Yeah, so Mary's talking about Stanton Miller's, the house that Stanton Miller probably lived in with his family, that stood until the 1980s or 1990s. And very likely, I mean, so if you owned an older farmstead, if you're working in your garden, you probably found stuff, broken bits of crockery, dishware, bottles, right? It's a simple thing, but it's worth remembering, they didn't have curbside garbage pickup in that era. Stuff broke around the house. You had leftover, clippings from, last night's dinner that needed to get thrown away somewhere. So they didn't want to take it far. They had a lot of other work to do. So very likely, if you have an older home, you will find, these various cisterns, privies, all kinds of other backyard features somewhere in the vicinity of your yard that are probably, full of little bits of, historic gold.
Another question, do you have technology that you use to overlay plat maps on modern maps?
Yeah. So that's great.
The scale.
Right. So the question is, can you overlay the old plat maps like this with modern landscape maps? And the answer is yes. And you can do it through geographic information systems software. The problem is scale. So when you do that overlay, so we have section 4 here, and we know there's fairly good reliable surveys for where these 4 corners of section 4 are. Getting those to sync up with modern landscape features is really hard, and there are other factors. So these plat maps you have to remember, were produced primarily as land records. To know who owned what, where, who should be taxed, what land was available for sale. They weren't as concerned about the specific location of an individual structure. That wasn't a big priority as far as being, precisely mapped. So you can, while these lines are fairly reliable and property lines are fairly reliable, that house might have been there, might have been there, might have been there. That wasn't, getting that exactly right wasn't a thing. So there are limits to, how you can extrapolate information from these early maps. But they are still, indispensable for a lot of stuff.
Is that a resource available to the public, that thing to line them up? Because I do that all the time.
Right, I know, me too. So we're
can go to get them and have them lined up.
Yeah, no, not publicly available now. Typically it would be through the university or somewhere where the geography department at a college where they have access to that software and could sort of get these images for you and then do the overlays. But yeah, someday, right? I mean, it's not. The technology isn't unimaginable. It just hasn't gotten there yet to where there's a remarkable amount of things that we can do now on the internet that would have required a specialist years ago. So it'll come. It'll get there. Yeah, in the back.
Do you know where the Verona swimming pool is?
I do not. No. But sorry, the question is, the
So you've never
Verona
done
swimming
any
pool.
digging around there?
I have not, no. No, are you talking about the actual?
The outdoor Verona pool, which
Okay,
some
not,
people
not
think it's
the,
just a
not the
hole,
swimming
but
hole
it's a
by the
pool.
quarry.
Fireman's Park?
Yeah.
Fireman's Park?
Yes, that's what she's referring to.
Fireman's Park, okay, yeah, sure, yeah. No, I have not done any digging around that area, but,
Where is that connected to the Sugar River?
Well,
I will defer to local experts. Like I said, I know a lot about this area, but I don't know, you guys are the experts. So the question was, how does the pond, right, the swimming hole down at Fireman's Park connect to the Sugar River?
Yeah.
And my inclination is to say it doesn't, that it's spring-fed, but I'm not sure about that. Okay, so yeah, so the consensus is spring-fed, it's not connected.
But
Oh,
the
it's not
Badgerville Creek
connected.
goes right next to it almost.
Oh, okay, so it's closer to Badgerville Creek.
Yes, it is.
Yeah,
Okay.
But that swimming pool pond was developed by Heartland's Gravel Company.
Right.
that's what I assume. Yeah,
For many years.
40s and 50s.
right, that's, a lot of times, that's how those swimming holes get started, right, as quarries or gravel pits, yeah. Yeah, great. Yeah, Jesse?
I'm curious, the Stewart and Young site, you didn't find anything, but did you find evidence that that actually was a human clearing there? Because I want to put one of these up next to it at some point.
Right.
And could it just be a place where there's no trees, or did you find evidence that a human being messed with it?
Okay, yeah, so the question is the site of the first settlement on Badger Mill Creek in 1837. You know, is there any definitive evidence that that this depression that we found was the product of human activity? And the answer is no. We really, we found one piece of a cow vertebra in the test that we did around.
Well, there you go.
Right, so, where else could that have come from? Yeah, so this is a problem, so what we're relying on is essentially the correspondence between the location that we found and the stories that have been preserved. And, that's a really valuable way that we can do a lot of the work that we do, because, again, not everything is preserved. So can we say definitively? No. Someone could have gone out and 20 years ago dug that little depression into the base of that cliff next to Badger Mill Creek. But most likely, even if that's the case, we know that the original settlement was somewhere near there based on the stories that we have. So I should say that if you know the location, if you're familiar with Badger Mill Creek, if you're headed south out of town, cross Badger Mill Creek, and then there's this pretty abrupt rise, right? A nice little ridge line that crosses the road. There's a big retaining wall on either, at least on the east side. Presumably, the way the landscape is described in the story, right? The brothers go up onto a ridge, start digging their new home, right? They find human remains, they find Native American burials. So we also know that there are prehistoric burial sites up on top of that ridge. They may no longer survive because it's been developed for a lot of residential and farming use. But talking to some of the landowners who live on that ridgetop, they have found a number of very early 1800s artifacts. Saw a silver half dime minted in 1839 with a hole pierced through it. So someone was kind of keeping it on presumably on a chain around the neck. One side was a little worn, as you would expect. That's one of the earliest pieces of U.S. currency I've seen, in Wisconsin, from right up on top of that ridge. So it's a good match with the descriptions from the oral histories, but we'll never know for sure. But I think it's worthy of marking. I think we have strong evidence, a preponderance of evidence, right?
Cool.
Yeah.
Since you're concentrating on Highway 69, is there any theory or explanation of why there's such a curve?
Okay, yeah. So the question is, why does Highway 69 wander so much?
But that's where it's a real too-sharp thing.
Yeah, and it has many, many sharp curves in it. And I'm still working on the answer to that. And Jerry's looked into this a bit too. So it's funny that we live and die by our road system, right? Especially out in the country. But we have a terrible, terrible historical record of how that road system developed. It's really hard to know, when a particular stretch of road, first opened, formally. A lot of times the only way we can sort of piece it together is based on settlement patterns. Do we see a lot of properties being developed along a particular stretch of road in a certain time? That suggests there's probably a public right-of-way through there, that people are using to access those properties. But the records are really terrible. So it's actually a really interesting prospect to try to understand how over the course of 150 years, these roadways develop. That's the only answer I have, sorry. It's, I'm working on a project to try to overlay the whole series of, kind of in the way Jesse was talking about, overlay the whole series of plat maps from the periods that we have available, and then relate them to some construction records that we do have from Wisconsin Department of Transportation, or its predecessors. But it's tricky. It's really tricky. And it's, like, why don't we know that? It's amazing. Great reason to have a historical society, right?
On your map, is that, the non-grade section, is that the town of Verona?
Yeah. So this is the very north edge of the plat of Montrose Township, butting up against Verona right here. And then, let's see if I can, oh no, I don't have it, right, it's further back. But yeah, then the plat for Verona butts right up against it.
And those grid lines don't line up.
They're pretty reliable. I mean, within feet, probably. Keeping in mind that when these were surveyed in the 1830s, these original land blocks, right, were laid out in the 1830s. And, the guys who were doing it with, a conventional transit and essentially a chain that was 66.5 feet long, I think is a chain. And they were dragging it through the woods and the swamps. So they did a pretty remarkable job of getting, but they do wiggle a little bit for understandable reasons. And, there have been land disputes and lawsuits over that over the years. Oh, sure, yeah, sorry, Jerry?
In regards to your two houses, the red circle, that was a frame house, right?
Yes, as far as we know, the house that we excavated was a stone foundation with a frame superstructure.
The new house is a Clark stone house, right?
Yes. But on the Shallow property we're talking about. Yeah, so no longer extant also. But yeah. So Jerry's saying, so the two houses on the Stanton Miller property, this is the one we excavated. Probably a sandstone block foundation with a frame or timber superstructure. This house here was built about the same time and built from the same materials, the same multicolored sandstone block, but it was entirely of masonry. It was entirely stone. So possibly built by two people, possibly not. Maybe just different points in time, different amounts of money available, right, for construction. But it looks like the sandstone for both the foundation that we looked at and the entire house in the blue circle there were quarried from the same location somewhere nearby.
So this is 1890, but earlier, the 1873 and the 1861, did it show separate owners for those possible parcels?
Yeah, so when we look at previous plats, there is a property line that kind of runs right through here, separating this kind of eastern third of the quarter section from this portion. And this is where we get Patrick Clark and Bullard. Was it Peter? Peter Clark. Peter Clark and.
Peter was there and I think
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So Bullard and Clark owning the property separately. So and probably those families had something to do with the construction of these houses in the late 1840s, early 1850s. But we can't know that for sure at this point.
Do you have any information on the area around the Madison School Forest? Part of that was originally purchased from Don Stewart in about 1958.
No, yeah, no.
Done anything over in that area?
I think we talked about this. Am I remembering right? Yeah. No, I actually been really looking forward to having an opportunity to look around there at some point.
I'm one of the naturalists that leads Madison
Yes.
School kids around there. It'd be great to have some kind of human history information from that area.
Yeah, that would be a great project. Yeah. And I should say too. So, in honor of Preservation and Archaeology Month, right, I brought along a bunch of sort of giveaways here. They do a poster every year for archaeology and building preservation. So the theme is 100 years of the Madison Capitol, not counting the burn. So I have posters there, and there's some bookmarks and stuff you can grab, membership forms for the State Historical Society, and I also have business cards. Feel free to grab one. If you have something interesting in your backyard that you'd like somebody to look at, or a forest you'd survey, let me know. Yeah, Ruth?
I might have missed it, but how long did you say you're going to be working on it? And do you have others, which sites you can tell us about? And the second part of my question is, when you are all finished, what is the layout of the highway going to be?
Yeah.
How are they making these changes?
Right. Okay, so the question is, are we continuing to do any work on the corridor, and what's the likely outcome as far as where the highway will end up being located? So we're not currently doing any work, but there are 2 additional sites that we had some logistical problems getting access to that we may end up looking at. One is another early settlers farmstead. It's I believe the house associated with the Luther Green family, who owned a big chunk of land just south of Basco on the east side of Highway 69 in the 1840s and 50s. There's another name there too. It's another Clark. There's another Clark that's involved there too at the very beginning that I can't remember. And then there's one other site that hopefully we will have the opportunity to look at, depending on, and this is sort of the answer to your second part of your question, depending on how the engineers sort of make their final decisions. Our work is entirely sort of for the purposes of planning at this stage. It's not research driven. So if the engineers decide they need to move the road here or there, that will affect the future of the work that we can do. As any of you have been, there was a public meeting just last week, maybe, if I remember right, if I saw in the news, on the project. So they're still finalizing plans, and some of that finalization involves the locations of some of these sites that need to be avoided or need to be investigated further to try to recover any information if they do decide that they really have to run the road right through them. But there are some significant changes, as I understand, to the current alignment of the road. So you'll see some big changes in the next 5 years, if the money doesn't run out. Right? Yeah.
There's a spring and a small pond right on Remy Road near Butts Road.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I understand that was a place where travelers would stop and water their horses and get spring water probably on their way to Madison.
Right, and that's a spring at Ramey Road and Butts Road, and that's your neck of the woods, Jerry, right? That's the old Ramey farm.
Right, it's still owned by the Trust, and it was the McFadden farm, and an Indian trail primarily.
Yeah, there's an interesting history of that road connecting to the mining area down in Exeter.
Yeah, the road that crossed the Sugar River at Belleville, pretty much where the railroad bridge is, it went north, and shortly after going north, a section of the trail went east over to the lakes, Kegonsa, I believe, and then it proceeded to go north to Madison on the west side of Lake Mendota, and then further, the references are, it went further to the pineries to the north. But as it went south out of Belleville, it went down into the Exeter lead mining area. And that road parallels what I call Reamy Road, which goes right across my front yard. And the reference to the spring and the, I don't know as though it was the stage stuff, but that trail became a wagon road, and there was the McFadden people owned that, and the spring is still there, and it really has an abundance of watercress in it right now, in case anyone's interested. And then it proceeded pretty much along Remy Road and continued north that way. So it definitely was an Indian trail. And as you get up to the Remy farm, there's an old stone building at that farm that was what was called Scoville's Store. And so it was a stopping point. At this spring, however, was the first post office out of Montrose Township. And there's a plaque in my front yard, actually, that mentions the history of that trail and the early post office. And on into the night, I can give you the second, third, and fourth chapters of all this if you wish.
Yeah, thanks, sir. Thanks. Yeah, and that's a great example of the kind of problems, right, with trying to understand how our road system has developed over the decades. That road, which is now almost invisible, was probably a major route in the early 1800s. It's still visible a bit on the landscape, but changes in development patterns, right, have completely veered us away from those old routes in some cases. So when we look for the routes that used to mean something to people, we often have to look off of the main highways, but rarely are they necessarily the same. Yeah, great. Well, thanks. Well, if there are no other questions right off, let me let folks head on their way if they've got something to do Saturday, and I'll be here. I'll be happy to talk with you if you have any other questions. But thanks so much.